small Yorkshire village, a murderer comes calling. Crucial evidence lies hidden for years.
The first time the net was closing in on the killer.
Slater?
A trail of blood stains the pavement outside a house on Bonner Court Road.
I could see on the footpath and around the front door blood on the floor. So clearly there'd been a fight and a struggle and somebody was injured.
Humberside detective Colin Andrews has been called to the scene of a stabbing at the home of Carol and Keith Slater.
As I walked into the house, I looked to my right and I could see Keith was obviously dead. Clearly heavily blood-stained, and it was obvious to me that he'd suffered some sort of wound in the area of his head.
So, what do you see?
On the street, Officer Philip Bell controls the growing crowd of onlookers.
Hesel's a small village. We very rarely have murders in Hesel. I can't remember one in the last number of years. It's just a nice area. So our interest was obviously highlighted and raised.
Perhaps the attacker was known to Keith, and very quickly we'd identify who'd done it and be in a position to arrest them.
Detective Andrews learns the victim's wife, Carol, witnessed the brutal murder. She describes how she and Keith were sleeping upstairs when a knock on the front door woke them at midnight.
This is obviously an unusual time for somebody to be knocking at the door. Keith got up out of bed, put his trousers on and walked downstairs. Carol was listening to what was going on.
Carol heard Keith talking to the man downstairs, and the man downstairs said the word Slater.
And then she heard a scuffle, and she ran downstairs.
Terrified and confused, her husband stabbed and bleeding, Carol then witnessed a bone-chilling sight.
Husband's attacker was looking directly towards her and Keith when she viewed him on the footpath of the garden. She describes him as being obviously male, white, broadish build with extremely dark, piercing eyes.
The thing that really stuck in her mind was his staring eyes and the gaze that he had at her.
That was the split-second look at Keith's killer. Ran off down Bonner-Court Road.
Carol tried in vain to save her stricken husband.
Carol obviously summoned the emergency service to come to the house. Instead, comforting Keith until the police and the ambulance service arrived. She was very, very upset, and then had the trauma of him dying in her arms.
Keith Slater was 35 years old, a driving instructor with 2 young children. Carol is escorted from the murder scene to her mother's house, where the children were spending the night. A forensics team scours every inch of the Slater residence.
Detailed forensic examinations were made, looking for fingerprints, and blood samples were taken. My initial actions were to make sure that we'd secured evidence, look for the murder weapon, and identified any suspects who may still be at the scene or in the area of the scene, really.
But no murder weapon is found in or near the home, and the killer is long gone. He could now be anywhere in the village, or even miles away in the surrounding city of Hull.
There was some neighbours nearby who had actually heard a commotion and seen a man run past their house. This man fits the description of the man that attacked Keith.
It's an important first lead, pursued by scene-of-the-crime officer Trevor Largley.
What I did was follow what I thought to be the route from the house, the way the offender had made his egress, which was following the most simple route and quickest route.
Largley believes the killer fled along a pathway 400 yards from the Slater house, then onto a footbridge across the main road.
This was crucial so that we could look for any evidence that he may have discarded.
But a disturbing question remains. Who carried out the vicious attack, and why?
I presumed that this would be a murder that would be fairly easy to solve. But as the investigation progressed, we realised how complicated this inquiry was going to be.
The morning after Keith Slater's fatal stabbing, anxiety spreads through the streets of Hessel, Yorkshire. Police interview the victim's grieving family.
Such a difficult time for everybody. Nobody can do anything or bring him back. All you can do is give them comfort. And the kids as well. Because it must have been so hard for the children.
A portrait of Keith Slater emerges.
Oh, he was a great dad. Great dad, absolutely. We're just one happy family.
He was described as a gentle giant, and in all honesty, nobody had a bad word for him. He was a genuine person that had nothing to hide.
He was a driving instructor. We knew that he was a keen rugby player at Hessel Rugby Club, and was a frequent visitor there. The family were normal, quiet individuals, so this added to the mystery. Why would anybody want to kill a happily married man from a normal family in a quiet part of the city of Hull?
With no obvious suspects and no murder weapon, police are desperate to find any physical evidence linked to the crime.
A bloodstained tissue was found on the footpath leading across the footbridge.
It's the same path, most likely used by the killer.
A lady on the morning of the murder had seen this tissue in the bush and noticed blood staining on it. Given that this was the escape route of the killer, this was an important piece of evidence for us.
In 1988, before DNA profiling, police have no way of knowing exactly whose blood it is. But they hope lab tests will soon identify the blood type. Meanwhile, the post-mortem reveals details about how Keith Slater died.
Because of the nature of the injury, whoever had delivered this blow had actually been standing above Keith when the knife had been inserted into Keith's neck, and it was one single stab wound that killed him.
The wound on the left side of Keith's neck suggests they're looking for a right-handed killer.
Mrs. Slater, this is
Working from Carol Slater's description, they develop an artist's impression, or photo fit.
She describes her husband's attacker as having extremely dark, piercing eyes, spiky hair. Quite a distinctive description that she gives of her husband's attacker.
Yes. Yeah, that's him.
It was a square face, thick jaw, thick neck, very short haircut. The eyes seemed to be almost piercing. He looked like a murderer.
Murderer is in his mid-20s, 5'6" to 8 inches tall, of stocky build and with spiky hair.
Police release the photo fit to local media. They can only hope someone, somewhere, will recognize the face of a killer.
just in here.
On day 2 of the investigation, police ask Carol if she knows of anyone who would want her husband dead. Her first reply is no.
Carol just seemed a normal, law-abiding citizen who'd witnessed a terrible crime. A normal, happy, married woman who cared for her children, cared for Keith.
But she then makes a startling admission. She does know one man who may have wished Keith harm.
Well, I did have this affair.
Carol confesses to a 5-month-long affair with a former co-worker.
Did you tell Keith about this?
She says she ended it a year ago, but the man, Joe Henry, recently tried to reconnect.
You know, Joe, I thought you were done playing games with my wife here.
Joseph Henry had run Carol Slater to home, and the call was taken by Keith, who was not very happy.
Call here again, I'll break your legs.
We learned that following that conversation, which had occurred quite some months before the murder, Joe Henry had left that employment and actually left the Hull area and moved down to London, which is about 200 miles away from Hull.
But it's over and I ended it.
Carol swears she's had no contact with Joe Henry since he moved away. But with jealousy and betrayal in the mix, police are suspicious.
It's very common in murders that there's a connection between the victim and the murderer, and sometimes that can be the spouse or the partner. One of the tasks that we had to look at was Carol involved?
Slater.
Carol claims the attacker was a stranger, but is she lying to protect her lover? Police review her behaviour.
Carol was extremely cooperative, a very helpful witness for us. No such motive was found.
There was no reason not to believe Carol's version of events.
To be certain, police in Surrey questioned Joe Henry.
He confirmed that there had been a relationship. If we believe what Carol was saying, then she would have identified Joe Henry outside her house, and clearly she didn't do that. She said that she didn't know who Keith's attacker was.
Detectives learn Joe Henry has a solid alibi through his job as a nurse.
He was working at a hospital on the night of Keith's murder anyway.
Discounting him as a suspect, investigators begin analysing dozens of items found in the extensive search area.
We recovered a variety of things like discarded pieces of clothing, pieces of jumper, pieces of correspondence, and a matchbox.
It was just a matchbox with 2 rows of numbers on. It had been found about another half a mile along the road at a disused property.
What relevance could it have to our inquiry? Well, we didn't know. We decided to keep it, along with lots of other items, just in case in the future it could be useful to us.
Widening their hunt for leads, police visit Keith's rugby club, where the manager relates an intriguing story.
Mr. Stevens?
One gentleman who worked at the club on the Tuesday before Keith died was actually doing some work in the beer cellar. A person came up behind him who we couldn't describe, but who asked if Keith Slater was there.
Hey, is Slater there?
No.
He was looking towards the door. The guy was backlit, so he could see what he physically looked like, but he couldn't see facially what the man looked like.
Slater, to our witness, gave the impression that this person wasn't particularly friendly towards Keith or didn't know him.
This gentleman, how did he come in here?
This is now the second time detectives have heard of a stranger asking for Slater.
So why was that person asking for Keith? Was indeed that the murderer?
Thank you, Mr. Stevens.
The case has taken another strange turn. Investigators now suspect Keith Slater's killer may have been hunting him for days, tracking his movements while waiting for the right moment to strike.
Slater?
Gentlemen, good morning. Detective Andrews, Homicide Police.
Police dig for more information on the victim at his former rugby club.
last couple of weeks or so, he's been in arguments with people.
Surprising rumours quickly surface. Rumours that, if true, would confirm Keith and Carol's married life was anything but ordinary.
Talk within the rugby club was that they were involved in wife swapping and things like that.
Peter Brodie was once Keith's best man.
And rumours began to circulate from a number of sources of people who knew them, who presumed that relationships were going on between the Slaters and the Brodies.
Keith's rugby mates tell police problems arose between the two couples when Keith began an affair with Brodie's wife, separate from the foursome.
The relationship has suddenly turned sour, and it fell apart shortly before the murder occurred.
Slater.
Could Keith's betrayal have been enough to provoke violence from a jealous Peter Brodie? Under intense questioning, Brodie denies any involvement in the crime.
No, it's not me.
Peter Brodie said that he was in London at a Michael Jackson concert, and that was confirmed.
In that case, Mr. Brodie,
And there's no evidence to directly link him with Keith's death.
That alone should eliminate Brodie, who also bears no resemblance to the photo fit. But could he still be implicated? Police soon get their answer when local residents recognize the portrait seen in the media.
People rang in and said that artist's impression looks like Roger Williams.
Roger Williams is a handyman who lives in Hull.
Then a link was put with Williams and Brodie, and it became apparent that he had done some garden work for Brodie. But Roger Williams did look like that artist's impression. He had a criminal record. He had more connections. He was a good suspect.
so Mr. Williams, you're saying that you've never heard of Keith Slater? No. Well, that's strange because
When questioned, Williams says he doesn't know the Slaters and had nothing to do with Keith's murder. But his alibi is weak.
Roger Williams said that he was home with his family.
Detectives think Williams is lying. They suspect Peter Brodie hired him not just as a gardener, but as a contract killer. Suspicion grows when another tip comes in.
He had been seen burning a pair of jeans. Was this because they were covered in forensic evidence, or indeed had Peter Brodie hired Roger Williams to kill Keith?
Just 3 days into the investigation, authorities have a strong suspect. Roger Williams matches the description of the killer. Not knowing the Slaters, he'd have to confirm Keith's identity before attacking him.
Slater.
So he was put on an identification parade.
Now all detectives need is for Carol to recognize Williams face to face.
Carol viewed that parade and didn't pick him out.
It doesn't completely eliminate Williams as a suspect. But when neither he nor Peter Brodie crack under further interrogation, the case against them becomes purely circumstantial. The investigation is back to square one. But 5 days after the murder, there's finally some good news from the forensic science lab. They've identified the blood on the recovered tissue.
We were told that the blood was of the same blood group as Keith. We were fairly sure that tissue had been used during the murder.
It seems likely the killer threw the tissue away after wiping Keith's blood from his hands. But why was he killed in the first place? Police hope to find the answer by delving further into the Slaters' history of infidelity.
were rumours that he was trying to chat up the girls that he was taking out on driving lessons.
A man came forward and said to us that he'd seen Keith in his driving school car and noticed that the car was being driven by a female, a blonde female. This lady was described to us as blonde, beautiful, and wearing expensive perfume.
Hoping to trace the mysterious blonde woman, police sent her description to the media.
But despite many, many hours of investigation, this lady was never found.
It's another frustrating dead end. Finally, police get a break when they receive reports of a strange man seen in Hessel Square at 11 p.m. on the night of the murder.
There were a couple of sightings of a male asking for directions to Bonnecord Road.
The man resembles the photo fit.
He never knew where Bonnecord Road was. He's never been there before. And you can assume that he probably doesn't know Keith Slater as well.
Aye.
The stories point to a suspect already on the radar, Roger Williams. But as Carol Slater failed to recognise him, detectives have no hard evidence.
Keith Slater was a well-known and well-liked driving instructor in Hessel near Hull. He was married with 2 children.
6 weeks pass with no progress. Growing more frustrated by the day, investigators widen their appeal for information on a national TV crime show.
Information about this or any crime.
This is the latest thing we have. The report. The 3 men.
The move pays off when a man 200 miles from the crime scene calls in.
This gentleman had rung to say that he owned a property in the Surrey area. And in that property were living 3 men who had originated from a village near Hessel.
What the caller describes is truly bizarre.
These people had a strange interest in the occult, and that on one occasion he'd seen them dancing around a campfire in the garden of the property, saying Slater was evil, Slater must die.
Police are stunned when they learn one of the men is Joe Henry, Carol Slater's former lover. The investigation has taken another shocking turn. It's 2 months since a knife-wielding killer attacked Keith Slater on his doorstep and left him to die in his wife's arms. The investigation has taken detectives to Surrey, where landlord Dennis Hartford relates a strange story about his 3 tenants, Joe Henry, Patrick Brown, and his brother Martin.
He gave a picture of all 3 of them being interested in the occult and trying to summon down evil spirits. The older of the 3, which was Joe Henry, seemed to hold some sort of spell over the 2 younger Brown, Patrick Brown and Martin Brown.
Hartford claims Joe Henry has led the brothers in occult practices since their recent move from Yorkshire.
A picture emerged of them devil worshipping.
But the landlord then reveals something even more disturbing about ringleader Henry.
He often referred to Carol Slater as his gypsy princess, and clearly he was in love with Carol and was saying that his gypsy princess had been taken away by the evil Slater.
Could Joe Henry have somehow compelled one of the Brown brothers to kill his hated rival?
These were younger men who were influenced by him and believed that he had some devil powers, but the Brown brothers were very much under his influence at that time.
Police arrest the 3 men, who deny all accusations. But when their whereabouts on the night of the murder are checked, only Joe Henry has a solid alibi. He was at work. Patrick Brown says he was out drinking with friends, and Martin Brown says he spent the night alone, smoking marijuana. If either brother is lying, there is one way to find out. Back in Hessel, Detective Andrews asks Carol Slater if she can ID them. She says she once met Patrick Brown while working with Joe Henry, and she's almost certain he's not the killer.
Any others?
Carol had never seen Martin Brown, didn't know what he looked like, so we showed her a photograph of Martin Brown contained in an album of photographs.
If Martin Brown is the man Carol saw during her husband's murder, then surely she will recognize his picture.
She looked at that album of photographs and didn't pick him out.
No, I'm sorry. There's no one standing out. I'm sorry.
But when another compelling lead comes in, police stay on Martin Brown's trail.
A short distance from his house in Surrey, there was a travel agency. They were one of the agents for selling National Express coach tickets.
Detectives examine the agency's records, discovering that on the Tuesday before the murder, Martin Brown purchased a bus ticket to Hull.
It had been paid by a cheque, so it was all confirmed.
We could prove that Martin Brown had been to Hull on the Tuesday night, the night of the mysterious caller to the Hessel Rugby Club.
But Brown's explanation is simple.
They travelled from Surrey to Hull to attend a hospital appointment.
Investigators quickly contact the hospital. His story checks out, but the travel agency's records produce another lead.
Within a period of about 4 or 5 months, they'd only sold one other ticket from that travel agency to Hull on National Express coach, and that was purchased in cash on the 26th of August.
It's the day before the murder. But Martin Brown swears he didn't buy the second ticket, and since it was paid for in cash, there's no paper trail for police to check. They've got nothing on their suspect. What looked like a promising lead goes nowhere. It's a bitter disappointment. With nothing against Joe Henry and the Brown brothers but hearsay, they're released.
Despite their strange practices, there was nothing that would suggest they were violent individuals or would indeed want to kill Keith Slater.
Police now turn to hundreds of other leads generated by national media appeals.
We had a team of officers processing information that was coming in.
The thrust of the inquiry was still working towards proving that Roger Williams was Keith's murderer.
The blonde woman also reappears on the radar.
More information came in about the sightings of the mysterious blonde, and these were investigated.
But once again, their leads come to nothing, and the investigation stalls. In December, 4 months after his slaying, Keith Slater is finally laid to rest.
Somebody must know who it is. Is somebody's son or is somebody's husband? My brother's down there and they're walking free and they should be caught. Somebody should come forward, but nobody did.
Gradually, the level of new information coming in slowed down.
A year and a half after the investigation began, all avenues of inquiry have been exhausted.
We'd progressed as far as we could, and at that time we were no closer to finding Keith's killer.
The Slater murder investigation becomes a cold case. It lies dormant for 13 years.
case reopened in May 2003.
Philip Bell, now a full detective, is enlisted to re-examine the Slater file.
For me, the Keith Slater murder, which had been an outstanding murder for 15 years, was a great challenge.
Keith Slater's case had always troubled me, being the only case I'd been involved with which hadn't been detected. And I really felt in my heart that the key was there. So we decided, in the light of DNA and new scientific advances, to see whether or not the clues that we had, particular tissue, might reveal new clues.
Right, let's get this sorted.
Forensic scientist Gillian Leake begins DNA processing of the tissue.
What I ended up doing was having a look at the tissue paper under a microscope, analysing different areas to confirm where there was still blood staining available for analysis. This is then put into a sterile tube, and various cocktail of reagents are added to it to extract the DNA within the sample.
Such an old sample may fail to reveal anything new at all. But when the painstaking process is complete, police finally get the break they've been waiting for.
The blood on the tissue was from the same blood group as Keith Slater. But more significantly, they'd found some DNA material on the tissue that was not his blood.
The new genetic material is from previously undetected mucus.
It was the first real solid breakthrough that we'd got. Clearly, the DNA had always been there, but science had finally caught up and was able to identify it. We had a real hard piece of evidence now that we could link the killer with Keith. Now, it was a question of find the person, get the DNA, and we have the evidence of our killer.
Detectives target all the original suspects: Roger Williams, Joe Henry, Martin Brown, and Patrick Brown.
I concentrated on Roger Williams, obviously fit the artist impression, and he was a good suspect, without any question.
Police have gone 15 years without solving Keith Slater's murder. Roger Williams' DNA may now be all they need to end their long search for a killer. Finally armed with DNA evidence 15 years after Keith Slater's murder, police target Roger Williams. Hoping the suspect will volunteer a DNA sample, Detective Bell tracks him down to Hull.
It was a consensual DNA sample. He'd been arrested in 1988. He'd spent quite a number of days in the police service. He was distrustful of the police, and he was quite reluctant,
Let me tell you something.
as you can imagine.
I need some time to think about what I'm going to do.
Williams' refusal leaves police with no choice. They must move on.
But we still have Henry,
Martin Brown, his brother Patrick, and Joe Henry were next on the list to be investigated.
Police learn Joe Henry moved away from Surrey years ago. His whereabouts are unknown. Both Brown brothers are also gone.
Martin was in Australia and Patrick Brown was in New Zealand.
With both suspects out of the country, the only way to link either brother to the crime scene DNA is through family members still in the UK.
If we were able to obtain some DNA from the family, we'd be able to show a link that would at least say yes or no, that DNA belonged to the Brown family.
Mrs. Trotter, Detective Philip Bell.
And the best source of that would be mitochondrial DNA, which is the mother's DNA. She refused.
The Browns' father, the next best source, complies, certain his sons are innocent. As authorities wait for test results, they get an unexpected call. Roger Williams has had a change of heart.
He He was pretty open, and he just had nothing to do with it in 1988. It was nothing to do with me. Well, if that's the case, then just give us your DNA. And he did.
If William's sample matches the DNA recovered from the tissue, the case is all but over. Police will have found their killer.
But unfortunately, the result came back to say that it wasn't Roger Williams' DNA.
Williams is eliminated as a suspect. The 15-year-old case is now in danger of going cold for good. But a spark of hope appears when the forensic lab delivers the DNA test results on Patrick and Martin Brown's father.
The DNA material on the tissue was biologically linked to Mr. Brown Sr., who provided the sample. This was an absolutely significant breakthrough.
The hunt for a murderer is still on. With the list of suspects now down to 2, Patrick Brown volunteers a DNA sample in Christchurch, New Zealand. It's flown back to England for testing. At the same time, Bell phones Martin Brown at his home in New South Wales, Australia.
Nice, settled life there with his wife and a couple of kids. So it was a bit of a shock when I rang him out of the blue. Initially he said he'd think about it, and then as the conversation went on, he said,
"No, I won't give you it. You had your chance."
He was absolutely adamant that he wouldn't cooperate with us.
Martin Brown's refusal raises suspicion, which grows when the test results on his brother's DNA come back from the lab.
In relation to Patrick's sample, that was eliminated as well. So that left the only one person.
Say
In 1988, Martin Brown told police he was smoking pot in a London park on the night of the murder. Investigators are now determined to prove he's a liar and a killer.
Quite clearly he was our main suspect from that point onwards.
But extraditing their suspect from Australia proves no easy feat.
There are very difficult legal processes to go through in terms of bringing somebody back to the United Kingdom. Under UK law, a case must be case ready. He didn't have his DNA, we were not in a position to charge.
Desperate to find something more on Brown, Bell reviews all the Slater case material. The 15-year-old documents hold nothing new until
I came across a document that was a photocopy of a matchbox.
It's the matchbox found far from the murder scene.
It'd been taken to the police station by somebody called Mr. Harrison, but he'd actually found it on the 27th of August.
In 1988, like hundreds of other exhibits, it was deemed not relevant. But Bell now senses its prime importance.
To this day, I can still remember it was one of those like defining moments that you never forget.
He studies handwritten numbers on the matchbox, one row ending with a circled 4, the other with a circled 6.
The 2 rows of numbers were 18 to 1964 and 26 08 1988. And I said, "What's Martin Brown's date of birth?" One of the girls in the office shouted back the 18th of February 1965. And I was looking at that date of birth on the top of this matchbox.
Bell then realizes the other number, 26-8-1988, was the day leading up to the murder, which occurred just after midnight.
The date of the incident, which should have been the 26th of August 88, it was actually 0030 hours on the 27th of August. He was late in getting to Keith Slater's house because he didn't know where he was going.
Searching through the case exhibits, Bell finds the actual matchbox and discovers yet another number.
The number 32, which is obviously Keith Slater's home address.
It's another clear link from the matchbox to the murder. police consider Brown's occult fascination and wonder if the circled numbers hold some special significance.
We employed a numerologist to interpret the numbers for us. What he told us was absolutely astonishing.
If you add up the two rows of numbers, 18 to 1964, adds up to 31. So 31 is 3 plus a 1, which is 4, and 4 had a circle around it. And 2688 adds up to 42, and 4 plus 2 is 6.
The numerologist informs them that the 4 stands for death, and the 6 signifies an easy kill. Detectives conclude the author was calculating a favorable day to commit murder. Forensic scientist Melanie Pugh conducts one more test, comparing the handwriting on the matchbox to samples of Martin Brown's handwriting.
The similarities I saw were significant enough for me to be able to attribute that writing to him.
This was an absolute major breakthrough. All of a sudden we had a tangible piece of evidence that really linked the killer to the inquiry.
But will it be enough to secure a conviction when so many years and so many miles now separate Martin Brown from the violent crime that shocked a small village? "15 years after the brutal stabbing murder of Keith Slater, Humberside detectives believe they found his killer. It takes them another 3 years to convince Australian authorities their case is solid. Finally, in May 2006, police in New South Wales return Martin Brown to England to face charges.
That's him.
This was one of the most fulfilling moments of my life, looking the man in the face who killed Keith Slater to tell him he was under arrest.
And I looked into his eyes, and I knew that it was him that killed Keith Slater.
But with such an old case, chances of convicting Brown are slim, unless his DNA is proof positive he's responsible.
We obtained a reference sample from Martin Brown. His profile was then compared to what we'd obtained from the tissue. The probability that that profile came from somebody else was of the order of 1 in a billion.
This was the absolute final piece of proof that we needed, that Martin Brown was the person who killed Keith Slater.
Slater must die!
Detectives lay out their theory of how Martin Brown committed the murder.
It's only he who stands between me and my gypsy princess.
Keith Slater had taken the gypsy princess away from Joseph Henry.
Joe Henry never got over the loss of Carol Slater. Convinced the Brown brothers her husband Keith was evil, Martin Brown somehow felt compelled to take violent action.
Treat me as your brother and as your friend. Hey, is Slater there?
He planned to kill him at Hesler Rugby Club. He wasn't there.
Back in Surrey, Brown used numerology to pinpoint the 26th of August as a fortuitous day to do the deed.
But because Martin hadn't planned it properly, he didn't know where Bonaccord Road was.
It meant he arrived at Keith's house not on the 26th, as his numerology had recommended, but at 12:30 a.m. on the 27th. On this date, his stars were not aligned. The blood from his hands with a mucus-stained tissue, and then made one fatal error. He threw it away.
I believed he disposed of his knife and then spent the night nearby, hiding in the area.
The next day, he discarded the matchbox too, thinking no one would ever notice it.
I believe the following morning, he walked the short distance onto the Humber Bridge and simply got his bus back to London, was back in London, and thought that he'd actually got away with it.
18 years, he did. Before the trial, Martin Brown claims his brother murdered Keith and set him up by planting the tissue and the matchbox.
You don't admit it right now, Martin.
I wasn't there on the night of the murder. It was my brother and Joe Henry. They
Of
set
course,
me
this
up.
is nonsense, because if you're going to fabricate evidence against your brother, why not drop it at the scene? Why take it to a house a mile away and abandon it there?
And in 1988, Patrick could also not have known DNA testing could detect his brother's mucus on the tissue. There is simply no evidence linking Patrick Brown or Joe Henry to the crime. When Carol Slater sees Martin Brown in court, she's overcome with emotion.
She looked at him and she was very upset, and she did recognise him.
It's a completely different scenario from all those years ago, when Carol was unable to identify his photo.
It's very difficult to identify somebody that you've only seen on one occasion on a photograph, because there's no personality, there's no definition. But when you look at somebody in the eyes and see them face to face, there's a massive difference.
The testimony of Keith's widow is key. In February 2007, Martin Brown is convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison.
We're just happy that we've got a result. Justice is being done.
On any investigation, you do need an element of luck. Had Philip Bell not made that link between the date of birth and Martin Brown, then the significance of that matchbox would never have been found.
It was a great challenge, personally, to do that. But more so, I think, I got more out of it for the fact that I felt as if I was bringing justice to the Slater family.
It's always there. It's always there inside you. I don't think, no matter how many years goes by, it'll be there and it'll never go away.